Keeping an eye on. There we go. Keeping an eye on. There we go. All right. Hello, everybody. This special moment as we. All right. Hello. As we get everybody live and streaming, thanks for being patient with us while we all add on here. All right, brilliant. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this really great discussion about the new book, American Twilight, the Cinema of Tobe Hooper. We're really excited to see you all here. I'm Cameron Ludwig. I'm from the University of Texas Press, and I'll turn things over in just a moment to Will Dodson and Kristopher Woofter, the editors of American Twilight. But first, I wanted to let you all know that the book is currently available everywhere great books are sold. But if you would like a 30% discount and free shipping in the United States, you should order from www.utexaspress.com and use the code UTXTOBE at checkout. It is currently not for sale on any giant web-based bookstore conglomerates. So it is your best option for purchasing the book, and I'll drop a link in the reminder in the chat. I'd also like to send a huge thank you to the editors of American Twilight, Will and Chris. It's a really beautiful book, and this is a stellar event that they've put together. So thank you both. And thank you also to our special guests tonight, Stan Giese, Julius Banzon, Scout Tafoya, and of course, Joe Bob Briggs. So now I will turn it over to Will and Chris to get the party started.
Thank you. So my name is Kristopher Woofter. I'm one of the editors of American Twilight. I teach courses on in literature and the moving image at Dodson College in Montreal, Quebec, and I mostly teach on horror. And yeah, we've been working on this book for a couple of years, and appropriately, University of Texas Press has published it, and it couldn't have found a better home. And I'll turn it over to Will.
Hey, I'm Will Dodson. I teach rhetoric and literature and media studies at UNC Greensboro in North Carolina. I also research and write about horror and exploitation film and filmmakers. And just want to thank everyone joining us tonight. Thank you for registering and showing up. We're going to be taking a deep dive into all things Tobe Hooper and discuss many aspects of his long career.
So as we get started, we want to thank the University of Texas Press for hosting this event, and Cameron for helping us with all of the intro and tech and everything, infrastructure. They've been incredibly supportive from the beginning. Jim Burr, the acquisitions editor, has always been kind of excited about the project and interested. And we also want to thank the Collective for Research on Epistemologies and Ontologies of Embodied Risk. It's a mouthful, COE-RISC, in Montreal, and the Fonds de Recherche du Québec, Société et Culture, which is the funding agency that made the event possible, partly the event possible tonight as well.
So this book started as a roundtable at the 2018 Popular Culture Association Conference, in which we did an in memoriam on Tobe Hooper, who had passed away in August of 2017. We were joined by several scholars, including Christopher Sherritt, Jerry Metz, Clayton Dillard. And as we kind of drank our way through the conference, we developed the idea of a book that explored Hooper's work comprehensively, given that most assessments of Hooper focus on Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist secondarily, and either paint him as a one-hit wonder or as a filmmaker who was subordinate to Spielberg on Poltergeist. And so we wanted to kind of challenge that perception and open up more scholarly and popular audiences to Hooper's entire career. Now, there's no denying that Hooper never had a hit as big as Chainsaw, but it's also true that he directed more than 40 feature films and episodes of television. So we want to get into all of that in the book, and as much of it as we can in tonight's discussions, and see if we can articulate some consistent themes and styles throughout that career. So we're really excited to talk to this panel of guests, all of whom are Hooper experts. And we're going to go deep, dear audience, and discuss many of the underseen, underappreciated, and underrated Hooper films and TV work. We'll talk to each of our guests in turn, and then we'll come together as a group roundtable to tie things together and take questions from the audience that you can put in the chat at any time. So whether you're casual or obsessive, you should get something new tonight. Finally, we'll say we're not discussing Hooper's work in any order. We're just jumping right in.
Okay, so give you a little bit of context. Our journey here began in earnest as we flew to Austin, Texas, to look at a small collection of Hooper's papers and other items at the Harry Ransom Center at UT Austin. As we researched, we realized that we really needed to find Hooper's long unseen documentary, which he'd made 3 years prior to Texas Chainsaw, called Peter, Paul, and Mary, The Song is Love. Question was, how could the same guy have made both of these films? We needed to find the connection. It was important. Unfortunately, the copy in the archives was not available for viewing, so we had to look for different sources. I spent the next few months tracking down leads and eventually connected with our first guests, Stan Giese and Julius Banzon. Julius is the webmaster, many of you may know this, of the Tobe Hooper Appreciation Society, a website featuring essays, storyboard comparisons, and rare material, among other things, including its nighttime and early treatment by Hooper and Steven Spielberg for what would become Poltergeist. It's very important to talk about how much horror scholarship and horror fandom often cross over. And Julius operates his Hooper Appreciation, American Society, nice, his Hooper Appreciation Society blog with the categorical vigor and detail of an archivist. His writing on the site was influential in my analysis of Hooper's kind of Lovecraftian film mortuary for American Twilight. Julius then led us to Stan, who has worked in the entertainment industry for more than 30 years and who knew and worked with Hooper. Stan too approaches Hooper with the care of a curator. He has a book coming out soon, a kind of production diary on Hooper's spontaneous combustion, and is currently working on a book about Hooper's television film, I'm Dangerous Tonight. Stan had access to, as it happened, a VHS copy of The Song is Love documentary and generously provided us a digital copy. So a big thanks and welcome to Stan and Julius tonight. So let's start.
You're welcome.
Oh, thank you. Let's start with a reference to the film that you helped us find. Peter, Paul, and Mary, The Song is Love is a portrait of these three politicized musicians against the backdrop of civil rights protests in Memphis and Washington, D.C., showing them performing and interacting with protesters and organizers. There are elements in the film that recall the documentary opening of Hooper's first feature, Eggshells, particularly the carrying of a casket through the crowd. And some of the film's experimental references to the televisual medium prefigure similar moments of hyper-mediated static that you'll see in the film Poltergeist. In parallel to its portrait of a struggling America, the film is structured around statements on the freedom of political expression in art by the three musicians. And because this is a struggle Hooper himself would feel throughout his career, The Song is Love sort of set the tone for our framing of American Twilight. Julius and Stan, a lot of your work has been devoted to the challenges Hooper had getting many of his productions to the screen and distributed once they were finished, the way they were intended to be. For example, Julius, your blog does this in the form of some fascinating script, storyboard, and screenshot comparisons. And Stan, a lot of this comes in your firsthand knowledge of Hooper's on-set challenges. So I wanted to know if you would tell us a little bit about this kind of, Hooper's sort of challenges, his struggles, and from your different perspectives, and you can decide who starts who starts the game.
Well, I think it's important to note that Tobe was somebody who he loved movies, and he would do anything to make a movie. And any circumstance he found himself in early on, he would make commercials, industrials, documentaries, short features, any opportunity he had to make film, he would die for it. And that continued throughout his career. As his opportunities grew, he had more options. Later in his career, he had fewer options, but he still continued to grind it out. He was always interested in simply making movies.
Sorry, I muted myself to not be obtrusive, and now I'm not anything. Would you say some of the, because it seems like a lot of the television work by Hooper came out of that kind of urge to keep working? What would you say that's kind of true, or?
No, I absolutely believe that's true. He would, like I said, he would leap for any opportunity, and sometimes they were very dry, and oftentimes he would try to, kickstart a project himself. Spontaneous combustion is just such a project. It was, in fact, the first screenplay he had written since Chainsaw Massacre, and so it's kind of a unique document showing his own, his personality shines through. Whereas in some other projects that he came to, somebody else had done all the legwork, and that he just dropped in as a director for hire. So for me, Spontaneous Combustion is a very special piece. And I urge everyone to see it if you haven't seen it. If you have seen it, I urge you to reinvestigate it, reevaluate it. It pays great dividends for multiple viewings. Look, I'm not objective, but I love the film. I think it's wonderful, twisted, bizarre, mad in all the best ways. And so I encourage everyone to look at every piece in Tobe's catalog, because it will throw. Chainsaw is undeniably an iconic, brilliant, possibly the best horror film ever made. But it's not what he's all about. He has, like you said, 40 other projects that all differ from one another. He rarely repeated himself. He was determined not to repeat himself. And if you compare his films one to the other, I think you'll find that they're very, very different. They're far more different from each other than they are similar. One man's opinion.
So when I started blog like 10 years ago, Hooper was just this nebulous figure. He wasn't. It was only recently that biographical elements or people started caring about who he was and as a personality and as a director. So all this revival and renaissance, it really has to do also with what people are going to start learning about him as a person. So it's an excellent thing. It was not what my blog was about early on. Like you said, it was about the images, style. And then when in recent times, this is important that, what was your question again?
It was mostly around the Hooper's kind of challenge to get things to the screen that, post the instant initial success, and then later, having these kind of visions or creative projects that were either not distributed or he had trouble kind of getting, out the way he wanted them.
Yeah, so that's definitely the case. As Stan was saying, he was put into a box after doing Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then certain production circumstances dealing with overbearing producers, money men who didn't really understand his vision, and then unforeseeable things like the whole poltergeist situation, and going forth the kind of vague ways that kind of affected his career. So in terms of a biographical approach to understanding him, your book is very important in that sense. So going forth, that's all I've got.
In particular, the question too was like about kind of what you're doing. Your blog is kind of important in piecing together some of the things that we wouldn't necessarily know, right, about these, whether they're troubled productions or the challenges, and so would you want to talk about a little bit about that work, some of which is pretty painstaking, it looks like. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, let me actually jump in and ask about something specific that I'm curious about, if you don't mind. The dark.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about the dark for a second? Because you have some great material on the dark, which Hooper began in 1979. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he began in 1979, and then he was fired, and the film was finished by John Bud Cardos, who was a director who had previously worked on a bunch of Al Adamson movies and was coming off the artistic triumph of Kingdom of the Spiders with William Shatner, and kind of took that project over from Hooper. But you've got some material on the site that talks about some of Hooper's original footage and themes and work. And there's some of that.
What he was allowed to do on that film. That goes with the idea that okay, so the dark is something I'm very passionate about. I'm probably the biggest fan of that film that I've ever encountered. I think it's a great film in certain ways, but it was shot in the fall of 1977. Hooper only shot 4 days of it. And then when it was released in 1979, the producers had, of course, totally re-edited the film, totally reconceptualized it. But Hooper put time and effort into it. He spent 3 months preparing the film, and it was only 4 days that he shot, but there's probably a lot of DNA from Hooper still in the film, and I put a lot of time into some blog posts about that film, which is because I feel it does still have his imprint on it. He oversaw rewrites of the films, and so I've so it came to a point where it was the producers putting in laser effects into the film. They turned the creature into an alien creature, and that was completely not his concept. That was not the idea behind the film. And so I've tried to, I tried to revitalize that film's reputation. It won't happen, but
no, probably not. But the posts you have are fascinating, and for those out there, you can see some of this footage. That's just amazing to kind of think about in the context of the early films. I want to let me pivot a little bit and fast forward to near the midpoint of Hooper's career. as the audience may immediately know, I'm going to talk about I'm Dangerous Tonight, right? Now, if you haven't seen it, this is 1990. It was made for the USA Network, which was at the time developing several feature-length television films. You got Anthony Perkins, you got Madchen Emick of Twin Peaks fame, you got Dee Wallace, Arlie Ermey, just a great cast. And it's about this cursed Aztec ceremonial cloak that possesses its wearers and enhances their primal impulses. So Amick naturally is this repressed college student, orphaned, abused by, what is it, her grandmother she's living with? She gets possession of the cloak, makes it
abused by her aunt. Her evil aunt and her evil cousin.
So she becomes the Cinderella from hell all of a sudden. And John Paul Taylor writes about the film in the book and explores, among other things, that theme of repressed energies erupting in the present. But Stan, you were actually working on that film, right?
I did work on that film.
Yeah,
it was the year following Spontaneous Combustion. I was engaged in much the same capacity as a videographer and a journalist to basically document the process. It was a delight. I haven't talked about Spontaneous yet, but that was a very formative
come back to that
time in my life. That's okay. It's a long story. I did want to say one thing about Tobe, and it's a cliche, but I think he was very much ahead of his time. I think that there's a quote from The American Nightmare, which is a documentary about horror filmmakers, predominantly in the 70s and 80s. And he says, you make a film, and then 20 years later, you figure out what it's about. And I think that's so true for virtually his entire career. Certainly with Chainsaw, although it was a phenomenon when it was released, he felt people didn't really get it. They didn't get the humor. And it was some years later, people began to reinvestigate it, reevaluate it, and they began to laugh. I think that's true, and it's obvious from the Cannon films are a great example. Life Force, for example, was just derided on its initial release. Derided, dismissed, just tanked. But subsequently, relatively recently, it's been reevaluated, and it has a very high reputation. In fact, from my point of view, Life Force has supplanted the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as my favorite Tobe Hooper film.
Oh.
Controversial as that might be. I think it's important, to say that. Regarding I'm Dangerous Tonight, I'm steeped in it because I'm hundreds of words away from finishing my book about the making of the film. But it was very much a family affair. A lot of the same crew members from Spontaneous Combustion joined us on I'm Dangerous Tonight. Well, Tobe had a kind of a shorthand with his DP, Levy Isaacs, who was quite brilliant. I want to say, beautiful work. He's a great craftsman and a great gentleman. And I think if you compare, this is an interesting experiment, is to compare some of Tobe's back-to-back films to each other. If you look at Spontaneous Combustion, and then you look at I'm Dangerous Tonight, they are very dissimilar. They are, their color schemes, his whole approach, the themes, the stories are very, very different, although they still contain that patented Hooper oddness, that almost indescribable madness of the film. Although, I think I'm Dangerous Tonight is really quite tidy and, a sweet little thriller, but a very good film and overlooked. And I'm happy to say that Kino Lorber has announced that they'll be releasing I'm Dangerous Tonight on Blu-ray sometime soon, probably within the next couple of months. So keep an eye out for that. I think everyone should see the film. It's a delight. It's wonderful. I had the best time you can imagine taking part in it, and highly recommend it. I'm here as a champion of that film. I'm a champion of all of Tobe's films.
Yeah, that red dress is going to pop on Blu-ray. I'm excited.
Well, that's an interesting. Tobe's color theory is fascinating to me, and it runs throughout his career. And his manipulation of color and how he uses it is very instructive, fascinating all by itself. But in the case of I'm Dangerous Tonight, they pretty much bled all of the red from the film, except when the dress appears.
Yeah.
Maybe an occasional splash of red when there's a blooming rose in the frame. And it's subtle. It works on you very subtly. You don't feel it, but color is emotion. And when that red dress starts swirling, you just get caught up in it. I think it's a lovely film. Every aspect, great script by Philip John Taylor and Bruce Lansbury, wonderful cinematography by Levi Isaacs. Tobe's sensibility shines through, even though there's a bit of a restriction. It was a very, very short production schedule. He just cranked it out, and I think it's lovely, and I think everyone should see it.
You'll soon have a production history of the film that you're working on. That's why all these I'm Dangerous Tonight thoughts are in your mind.
Yeah, like I said, I've been steeped in I'm Dangerous Tonight for the past couple of months. I've been working on my book, which will be a follow-up to the spontaneous combustion book called Smoldering Embers. Available sometime soon at a bookstore near you. My book on spontaneous combustion was very much a production diary, a first-person narrative. The book on I'm Dangerous Tonight is different because I've taken myself out of the equation, and I can't say it's straight reporting, but it's not a first-person narrative. It's a kind of subjective journalism, maybe, because I'm invested in it, but I'm not a character that appears in the book.
Just learning about Hooper's methodology on sets. I mean, he's shown me some of his behind-the-scenes footage of Hooper working on these sets, and I don't know. I guess he does work differently from like other filmmakers, other sets. He has a different approach. These are the important things to learn about him to understand what was important to him about cinema, why we should be interested in what he has to say, why his work has longevity. So
it's hard to pin down his style because I don't want to say he's erratic, but he seeks out differences. He doesn't want to repeat himself, and but he still has that kind of spark of madness that is interjected in every, even the lesser works. You can tell that it's Hooper, and it's not anything that you can pinpoint. You know, I could talk about his process on the set. He was very, he's not gregarious, but he's very friendly, charming. Joe Bob can attest to this. He was on the set of Chainsaw 2. I think he'll back me up on this. Just a very charming, funny, hyper intelligent, focused individual who loved life, loved making movies. He was a mentor to many, myself included. And I really, I'm his champion. I don't have enough good things to say about it.
There's one thing that you mentioned, Stan, in your book on spontaneous combustion, this kind of incredibly detailed production diary, and hopefully I'm not giving away too much of a promo or a teaser for it, but there's a production, kind of like a sketchbook that you had passed around, and several of the production members and Hooper himself had kind of done different drawings that were inspired by the production, and one of them was a self-portrait that Hooper gave you, and the compelling image for me was of Hooper. His self-portrait is this like atomic explosion coming out of his head, but also the small the carousel in the film that after the scenes where the parents spontaneously combust, the carousel that the father gives to his son melts into a pile of just unidentifiable mush. And there's something, beyond the way that you help kind of characterize Hooper's kind of collective way of working in that film, that image for me is just it's a really powerful moment in the book where we get a sense of, you talk about Hooper likes a restless camera is something that you say, and but he also seemed to be kind of fond of being the restless artist as well. And yeah, so that was kind of a something that I found compelling, and you're getting at that with some of the comments you're saying about Hooper's energy and this kind of vigor on set, and the way he was kind of encouraging the group to work collectively. Yeah. How are we for, we're at 8:30, or should we be
Should we move on?
transitioning? I'm not sure.
I got muted there. Hold on. Yeah, we'll be transitioning here momentarily, but then we want to come back in the last segment because we still want to check in with you guys about some more on spontaneous combustion and the canon films. But now we're going to bring in our next guest, Scout Tafoya.
Hello.
Hi, Scout.
How's it going?
Great.
I'm going to throw headphones on just on the off chance that my mic starts feeding back here, which does not at all go with the lovely suit that I put on for this special occasion, but whatever, I'll deal with it.
We are having a little trouble with feedback, so if those of us who are not talking could mute, that would be, I think that seems to be the issue. And I just want to ask you, so it's gone, but this was gin. What are you drinking? It looks like scotch.
No, this is actually tequila. This is high-end tequila. I figured as it's a University of Texas event, I should do something that would probably be a little more Southern in flavor. So went for tequila.
Awesome.
Very, very excited to be here. I should say before you get into asking me questions about the stupid book I wrote, when I was 14 or 15, my dad bought me Profoundly Disturbing by Joe Bob Briggs as a birthday gift, and I devoured it. So I
hope you read it also.
Nope, just ate it, fork and a knife, just like Homer Simpson with the #1 edition of Spider-Man or whatever that he eats, which also was supposed to be a Tobe Hooper film, but yeah, so I just wanted to throw that out there as well. And I know Stan, he was a great resource while I was writing my book, and Julius, I've watched all of your work here, and obviously American Twilight, of course, an incredible and important addition to the academic community writing on Tobe Hooper. He was a guy who for years was not given the academic press treatment. I know because I pitched my book to a number of academic presses and I got rejected every time. So you guys are doing the Lord's work here. So I'm just so happy to be here celebrating Tobe Hooper with you guys. I mean, this whole panel of people who know his work better than anybody else, and it's cool to be here with people who love him as much as I do.
Well, thanks for saying that.
Can I interject here for just 1 second?
Sure.
Just wanted to tell Scout thank you, because he turned me on to his publisher, and they are publishing my book. And so thanks to him for making that happen. I really, really appreciate it.
A world with more writing about Tobe Hooper is a better world, and a world in which I want to live. So I was happy to do it. He sent me, when it was still called Charred Remains years ago, his book, and it was just so much fun to kind of relive the secondhand stories of Tobe Hooper on set. I mean, he's a man that I had done so much kind of psychological work on behalf of him because I had been so interested in his work and seeing these films. You do get a portrait of him, whether or not it's, the one that everybody else will tell you from having met him. And it was just such a kind of an interesting thing to be like, oh, this is who he really was on set. That was, it was a gift.
Well, this would be a good time to introduce you. Scout Tafoya, you can see his video essay series, The Unloved, on RogerEbert.com, and he's the author of
Cinemophagy.
Cinemophagy. On the psychedelic classical form of Tobe Hooper, available on Miniver Press. So, Scout, one of the films near and dear to your heart is one of Hooper's most critically maligned, and in fact, it's the last Hooper film to get a theatrical release. I'm talking, of course, of 1995's The Mangler. We actually have 2 essays in the book devoted to that film, which says something about the need for its reevaluation. Carl Cederholm and Clayton Dillard both discuss themes of capital versus labor, the realities of Hollywood as an industry, the treatment and status of women under capitalism, and more. Robert England has said that The Mangler is due for reassessment, and thanks to the spate of bad Stephen King adaptations in its wake, it has now risen near the top. Now, episode 46 of your video essay series is on The Mangler, and you argue for 8 minutes and 15 seconds why the film ranks with Christine and The Shining as, quote, a stylistic representation of the director's obsessions, not just a boilerplate transposition. Let's hear the argument.
First of all, that you remembered that it was the 46th edition just warms my heart a little bit. We're coming up on the 8th anniversary of The Unloved, so I'm feeling very old indeed. I tend to think that an author like Stephen King, because his work is so specific to the joys and the terror of the written word, that people given the assignment to adapt his work, they have to be able to see past it, essentially. I mean, King's own opinion of The Shining notwithstanding, that's a perfect example of that, where Stanley Kubrick was given this novel, and I don't think he quite understood the appeal of it beyond, its popularity and a sort of handful of symbols. And so he made his own beautiful work of art from it. And King hated it because it was nothing to do with the novel. And I think that going forward, that set a precedent for, to me, the most interesting and the most sort of lasting adaptations of that. I mean, some people still look at me like I'm crazy when I say that Christine is one of the 10 or 12 best American movies of all time. But to me, that is a perfect compositional study. It's a movie where John Carpenter, he went on record as saying he didn't really get the book. And so he made a movie that pleased himself. He made a film with just crystalline, just these diamond cut images set to this incredible score. That's a movie where he's really having a conversation with himself about what movies can be. And The Mangler, I thought, was just about the most beautiful version of that, where you take a kind of it's a King short story, and its ideas are all very much on the surface. And The Mangler starts with, I think I've said this elsewhere, like the perfect statement of its themes and its ideas, where it starts at the top, looking at the foreman in the factory, and then the camera slowly in this beautiful, this Max Ophuls camera movements down into the machinery, down into hell, and just the gears, the disgusting gears, and his son worked on making the machine and all that. Like, I just was so gripped by it. When I first saw The Mangler, 2014-ish, I was ready for the worst film of all time, because that's what I had been told it was. I'd read enough online listicles and stuff like that, and Joe Bob can tell you about the economy of writing lists for the internet. It's really all that they pay to do anymore. But a number of people had said, "Oh, this is the worst film ever made." And so I went in thinking that it was going to be that, and within 10 seconds, this beautiful camera thing, I was immediately having flashes to Lola Montez by Max Ophuls. And then it unfurls this essay about the sort of horrors, this disgusting oil-slicked industrial capitalist nightmare in which the film takes place. And I know that Stephen King is ideologically aligned with the way that Tobe Hooper took his text. Stephen King has been loudly and demonstrably leftist his entire career. And I know that they agree on these points, but I kind of almost want to hear what Stephen King has to say about the movie. And maybe somebody knows about this and I don't, but that'd be fine. But it's just like, he made this florid, beautiful, this kind of movie that feels like it was written in exhaust fumes. And it's fully of a piece with all of the other work that Hooper had done. I mean, going back to Eggshells, a movie where this kind of multicolored nightmare springs itself on these young idealistic kids. It was just sort of, that was when I decided to write the book, ultimately. My book, Cinemophagy, happened because I saw that movie. It was an afternoon. I think I downloaded it because it wasn't available anywhere. And I saw it. I thought, this is one of the most beautiful and strange films I've ever seen. How does nobody know about this? How does nobody talk about this? And why am I being told this is the worst film of all time? Mm-hmm. And I was radicalized by that screening of The Mangler. And the more that I looked into the other neglected films, the more convinced I was that this was a misunderstood genius. Not to resort to hyperbole. I wrote for years under my friend Danny King, who was the editor of The Village Voice, or the deputy editor of the film section of The Village Voice, and he used to tell people never to use the word master. No director is a master, no movie is a masterpiece, nobody's masterful, this isn't masterwork. So I tried not to, because I love Danny King, and that's a great rule, but I have a hard time refraining from hyperbole when I talk about Tobe's work.
So let me go with that and segue to ask you about a film that actually is the only film like unlike John Carpenter, who gets to be John Carpenter's everything, the only film by Tobe Hooper that's called Tobe Hooper's Something is a film that he was hired on as a finishing, kind of like, we fired this director, Robert Englund's the star, he wants you because he loves you. Tobe Hooper's Night Terrors, one of the strangest films in Hooper's filmography. I'm going to give it a little intro because I have a couple things I want to throw in there because I think I want to hear you talk about them a little bit.
Sure.
So the film is something that kind of has a lot of something that's in no other Hooper film since Eggshells. Sex, right? Like lots of sex,
Yeah.
And Englund plays two roles, Desaad and his descendant, and there's a kind of past present thing. Will and I watched this film in Austin, and we were just kind of like blown away by it. We were just expecting to be kind of giggling through it, and we were kind of like, this is kind of an awesome excessive film. And despite the fact that Hooper didn't originate the project, it has some of his consistent themes. It has a naive youth gaining experience through violence. It's got that she's wandering through, I don't know, Cairo or Alexandria with like short shorts and a crop top. Preoccupation with time, past consuming the present, the presence of yet another hysterical male. We didn't really talk about this so far, but Hooper's work is kind of filled with these kind of males who are losing their power, seeing it slip. Some have noted that the film has a lack of Hooper's usual kind of energy and vigor and has no sense of humor. But one look at the scene where the love interest in the film, Mahmoud, rides naked in slow-mo on the back of a horse across a beach with his penis flopping from side to side. Like suggests that there is no humor in this film, right? And there's excess here. And we're both really interested in hearing what you think about Night Terrors.
I love Night Terrors. I think Night Terrors is one of the most just effulgent movies of all time. I think Night Terrors is deliriously fun. And I just don't see how you get past the prologue where Robert Englund is playing the Marquis de Sade and think, he doesn't know what he's doing. There's no sense of humor here. It's, watch it next to Philip Kaufman's Quills, and then tell me which of them has the better sense of humor when it comes to that text about modern depravity and all that stuff. But there are a couple of touchstones that I think are key to understanding what Night Terrors is after. One of them is that obviously the Marquis de Sade thing in the background there, but that the daughter, played by Zoe Trilling, her name is Eugenie, which is Eugenie de Sade, which of course is Jesus Franco, right? So right away, you've got Jesus Franco in your background there. And then you got William Finley, who basically only ever worked for Tobe Hooper and Brian De Palma, right? So you've got that kind of like weird sort of perverted thing in the background there. Add to that William Finley plays an archaeologist, a Christian archaeologist. Every time he's breaking into these Middle Eastern tombs, he's saying like thank you to God. He's doing like Sam Rockwell in Fallen Angels. He just can't help himself. And so the movie to me emerges as a kind of tongue-in-cheek riposte to Indiana Jones, because all of these people want these ancient artifacts, right? You've got Robert Englund as the modern sex cult leader who wants whatever's in the tomb or whatever because he thinks it's going to give him magical sex powers in the present. And then you've got Bill Finley as this humorless, tightly wound, secretly sadistic archaeologist who is digging into the past for these artifacts that he wants to send off. I mean, it is a complete, rebuke of the glorification of Western archaeology and the way that we treat other cultures. As such, Hooper adopts this ironic view of the Middle East and Africa as a place of this kind of Orientalist fantasy, because he had seen it 1,000 times over. And I know that he knows this because he's seen the same, Edgar Ulmer movies and all that. Like my friend Ben Sachs, who writes for the Chicago Reader, talks about how the version of, the setting of Night Terrors is almost exactly the same as the setting of Edgar Ulmer's Club Havana. It's not actually Havana. Nobody's ever been to Havana who made that movie. But the point is, it's this like fever dream of those things. And that's what emerges in Night Terrors. And he's doing this knowingly. Obviously, when you're talking about the guy on the horse with his dick flopping one way or the other, it's this like insane, fully, charged erotic fantasia and everybody's wrong. Everybody thinks that they know, like, that they're going to get something, that they're going to go on this eat, pray, love tour of a foreign country and get like sexually, you know, awoke or whatever, or culturally, or any of that stuff. And of course, they're all in it for completely selfish gains. Patrick Coburn, he was writing about the Iraq War, and he said that the new Iraq had no secular heroes, and the same is true of Tobe Hooper's Night Terrors. Nobody who thinks that they understand what is happening to them actually understands it, and everybody who thinks that they're smarter than the guy next to them is dumber and suffers for it. I cannot tell you, that movie, there are so many shots of snakes, just piles of snakes, phallic snakes everywhere you look. It's one of the funniest movies of the 90s. It's so good.
That's great. And your enthusiasm for it, I hope, is its best advertising campaign, because it really is a hoot to watch. Time is going fast, you guys. We're gonna come back to Stan and Julius and Scout in a bit, but now it's time to welcome our next guest, who needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. You can see The Last Drive-In with Joe Bob Briggs and Darcy, the Mail Girl, on Shudder.com. You can read his regular column on Patreon. He's the author of 9 books, which are over my right shoulder there. Please welcome the star of Hogzilla, Joe Bob Briggs.
You just had to do that, didn't you?
Sorry.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Thanks
You know,
for being here.
One thing I'd like to point out, since we started out with the University of Texas Press introducing this whole thing, is that Tobe was the very first film student at the University of Texas. He was number one. The department was formed. It was called the Department of Radio and TV Film, and there were 2 students who signed up for it. So they signed up on the same day. So you could say he was tied for number one. And I never could find out who the other student was. He's lost to history. But that's where Tobe was. And let me point out, when we edit this or whatever, that several people have been sending in questions. The questions are really, really good.
Oh,
So
yeah.
don't miss the questions before we sign off. But happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're going to get to as many of these as we can, because they are great. But we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You've said if there's one thing in this world you're an expert on, it's that film. And one anecdote that has stuck with me from your Texas Monthly article back in 2004 was the craft services story. Can you, because I feel like it just captures Hooper's relationship with legitimate Hollywood. Can you tell that story?
Well, the year before the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was filmed, Columbia Pictures came to Austin to film a big budget movie directed by Sidney Lumet called Love and Molly. And it was the adaptation of the Larry McMurtry novel, Leaving Cheyenne. Now, every Larry McMurtry novel that's ever been adapted for the screen has been a huge hit, except for Loving Molly. It was one of the biggest flops in the history of film. I don't think Sidney Lumet ever talked about it again. But anyway, all the actors and anybody hanging around the nascent film community of Austin tried to get on the film or hanging around the film. And so on a certain day at the craft services table, some badly dressed hippie grabs some chicken off the craft services table, and the producer chases him down and says, "Are you working on the movie?" And he says, "No." And he says, "Put the chicken back." And the chicken stealing hippie was Tobe Hooper. So the reason I tell the story is that Love and Molly was this huge disaster that everyone wanted to be associated with. And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out before Love and Molly got out and was one of the most successful movies in the history of film. And nobody wanted to be associated with it. And so there's the irony of the film business in a nutshell.
Certainly.
reason this has come up several times. The reason Tobe had so much trouble with producers and with Hollywood in general is that he was a very nice guy. He was a very friendly guy, but he was not a glad-hander kind of guy. He didn't go to the party. And so he didn't talk to the producers. He didn't say, hey, listen, this we're going to make a lot of money. Stick with me. We're going to make a lot of money. That was never in his vocabulary. So socially, he never learned to play that game or didn't want to play that game. And if you look at the directors who consistently get big money, they are guys who go to the parties. They are guys who know these people. And so Tobe was always looking for the next financier because he couldn't work again with the one before. He couldn't work again with the one he just worked with last year. And so he had one period in his life where he made a good deal with Canon Films to make 3 films. And the reason they let him make 3 films is because he agreed to do the sequel to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which he didn't want to do. But all 3 of those films are beloved films today, or at least in our circles, they're beloved films today. And that is the Invaders from Mars remake, Life Force, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, which which has, in my opinion, has virtually nothing to do with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He just went in a whole different direction because he didn't want to make a sequel to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He had to make the sequel because he'd already made the other 2 films and been paid for them. But I think that's also the reason why, if he was a guy promoting the Tobe Hooper brand in Hollywood all those years, he might have ended up he might have had more money to do bigger projects. But actually, the first time there's been a Tobe Hooper brand is your book. 4 years after his death, there's finally somebody said, hey, there are commonalities to all these movies. There is such a thing as a Tobe Hooper movie. And but he's like, to me, he's like the Texas Takashi Miike, in that he follows the material. He doesn't have a style that he imposes on material. He follows the material and he does what that material demands, and therefore you get very, very different styles throughout his career. But what you can say about him, that the commonality is his visual sense is always strong and unpredictable. It's without cliche. His stories sometimes are cliches. He sometimes follows the predictable pattern of horror stories, but his camera work is never cliched. He had a great eye. He had an amazing eye. Hitchcock wasn't a writer either. What do we praise him for? We praise him for his eyes. We praise him for the way he was able to execute. Tobe Hooper is the same kind of director. He wasn't a writer. He was a director, and he was a great director. But when people are going around looking for somebody to hire for their next project, they base it on, we know he did this, and so it'll probably look like that. But with Tobe Hooper, it was not going to look like that. It was going to look like something totally new that he invented for the next thing that he was about to tackle.
Well, since you mentioned that, and since several people have asked in the chat already, it might be worth just real briefly tackling his one big budget moment, which was Poltergeist, which, of course, ended up hurting his career, almost destroying his chances of getting any kind of budget like that. But if you watch the film, as you say, right, there's no way you can think that is a Spielberg film. It looks like everything Spielberg would shoot Twisted. And
Well, yeah, I mean, let's the urban myth or urban legend or libel that was put on Tobe Hooper after Poltergeist, namely that Spielberg directed the film, Ghost directed the film. First of all, if you let me just attack it. I've attacked it other ways. Let me just attack it this way. If you look at what Steven Spielberg was doing in the year, what was it, 1982, when he was at the height of his fame and about to launch E.T. He didn't have time to go direct another film. There's no way. Let's check his appointment calendar. He was not going to that set every day. So on its face, we can scientifically prove he did not direct the film. However, what happened is there was an LA Times reporter who was on the set on a certain day when Steven Spielberg was hanging out on the film simply because he liked the film. He liked Tobe Hooper. They got along. They discussed at length what was going on, what would be going on in the film. And Spielberg directed some second unit stuff while Tobe was shooting the first unit stuff around that house that they used. And this led to the reporter later published something saying that possibly Spielberg had a hand in the direction of the film. No, I mean, you don't say the second unit director has a hand in the direction of the film, and the second unit director just happened to be famous that day. But the rumors wouldn't go away. And I think it was partly because the idea of, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre guys doing this, big budget film, that can't possibly be true. And yet, all the films that Steven Spielberg produced during that period, they do have a sort of glow about them. They have when he does the suburbs, he really does the suburbs. They have certain things in them that he may have influenced, but he influenced those for Robert Zemeckis just as much as he influenced them for Tobe Hooper. And there's no rumors going around that he ghost directed Robert Zemeckis's films or any other person that worked on a Spielberg produced film of the early 80s. So the libel only spoke to this one director, and it did hurt him, and it did follow him around. And it's unfortunate that one thing that happens on the internet is that if there's something that seems remotely plausible, that's interesting like that, it'll be repeated thousands of times. And so that's what's happened in the internet era, is that particular factoid gets repeated and repeated and repeated. But I thought he did a wonderful job with Poltergeist, and it just shows what he could have done with larger budgets. I think if he didn't have money problems in terms of raising money film by film by film, which is the most soul exhausting thing you can do in the world, he probably would have done 20 more films, and he probably would have, and there would have been some stunning things that we don't have the benefit of, because he didn't have that home. He didn't have that one big producer who was backing him.
There's actually, this is kind of coming up. There, a couple of the questions are revolving around this too, and it follows from what you're saying too about, Hooper. There's this kind of sense that, there's a battle of authorship for Poltergeist, and everybody finds that really intriguing. This sort of like, which scene is the most, most Hooper in this kind of vaguely Spielbergian film. Spielberg wrote the script with some other writers, and so there's that. But the idea too that Hooper's his identity as an artist kind of became also even at the same time as this success that he had with Poltergeist was being kind of questioned in his authorship. after that happened, his name becomes this kind of like a sales pitch for different types of things. So Tobe Hooper's Night Terrors is that because his name carries a certain kind of aesthetic or a sense of horror or even a politics. And we're thinking about the television productions that Hooper directed and why he was asked to do those. There are a couple of different series, Dark Skies and Taken. Yeah, and especially Taken, which is a Spielberg produced show, which is a pretty mainstream slick show. But the first episode, the one that the pilot that Hooper directed, is pretty brutal, and it has a brutal moment in it anyway. And there are certain aspects where these kind of aesthetics are in tension, but it does seem like Hooper becomes this kind of his name is a kind of brand, even as he's losing that, he's still being used as that. And that's do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think they were trying to create a brand. I mean, the way you start doing all that TV is your agent starts giving you these job offers. The agent starts going out and getting you these job offers because you're not getting feature film deals anymore. And so that his as was pointed out earlier, Tobe wanted to be on the set. He wanted to be making movies. He wanted to be on the set or in the editing room. He wanted to be working. And so he brought his same energy to those TV projects as he brought to feature films. But he was not a brand in the sense that John Carpenter was a brand, or Wes Craven was a brand, or I mean, he was more of this is a weird comparison, but he was more of a Larry Cohen in that nobody knew what really Larry was going to do with his next movie, and so and so you didn't really know what you were buying if you bought into a Tobe Hooper film. And as I said, he wasn't a guy who comes over to your house and offers you cigars and says, we're going to make so much fucking money on this next movie. He just wasn't a darling of investors. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Larry Cohen comparison. Kristopher Sherrod in our book makes the same comparison, just kind of uncategorizable, unpredictable, but always edgy and artistically ambitious.
Can I say something about Poltergeist very quickly?
Sure, come on in.
Hello?
It's about time to say.
I just wanted to say that it's a scandal what happened with Poltergeist, and Tobe still hasn't received, I think, the credit he deserves for that rather brilliant film. However, if in fact he'd received that credit, we wouldn't have Life Force. We very likely wouldn't have Invaders or Chainsaw Massacre 2. So for that reason, it is what it is. Life is what it is, and I am grateful that those films exist, and I'm grateful that the films that he went on to make exist, and that he rallied, and he didn't allow it to, destroy him. He overcame.
Absolutely. Joe Bob, one more question, and then we'll bring everybody in to have a round table with some of these questions. And you discussed this briefly in your Dinners of Death special on Shudder, Tobe Hooper's final film, Jinn. And I think I read something you wrote about it as well. First horror film made in the United Arab Emirates, and they bring in Tobe Hooper, and then they suppress it, and then on top of it, on top of everything, the version of the film that gets released, you see very little United Arab Emirates. It's all of a sandstorm and an apartment building, an old dark house. So Could you comment on that a little bit?
Well, I think we'll never know exactly what film that he made because, he went through the same censorship battles with Jen that he went through with the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I can see why he was attracted to that project. Besides, I think it was a $5 million movie. And so there weren't any other people asking him to do a $5 million feature at that point in his career. And, but the Jinn, the Arab version of ghost or spirit, or a spirit that can be either benevolent or evil, is obviously a rich vein of storytelling material. I don't think the script was up to his normal standards. However, you have to say, if I'm looking at, okay, it's the first horror film in the Middle East. It's the first time to really attack the subject of the jinn, and it's Tobe Hooper. I've got to say that's going to create some magic stuff. That's going to create some interesting visual stuff. And so all I can think is that he must have come up against the reality of trying to do a hardcore horror film in a Muslim society, and in a society that was just not as open as it seems to be when you go to Dubai. I think they did a lot of it in Dubai, and they're friendly to foreigners, but they still have their own traditions, and it's a place where they have censorship, or they have government censorship, and so that film had to go through government offices before it could be released, and I think things must have happened to it. No one has told the story. Some reporter, somebody needs to go over there and find out the real story, because I've never seen the full story of what happened to that film told. I can't believe that the film that resulted is the original film that he turned in.
Well, I can't think of a better segue to bring our guests back in, because Scout, Stan, and Julius have all claimed that they've seen the director's cut.
Oh, they've seen the original film. Okay.
Now, Chris and I have not. So, guys, you want to give some insights? Let's start with. We'll go in order. Go ahead.
So you have to tread carefully in this sense, or not. So it's like he turned in a director's cut. They weren't happy with it. They changed it. And it was released in the United Arab Emirates and in the whole MEA area. So it got a release. We should be happy about that. The theatrical version, it made a good amount of money for the company. He brought his cinema to that area. But the company has not really, they haven't been forthcoming, and his version has never been released, but some of us have seen it. And where should we go from there?
Yeah, well, Stan, what are some things in the director's cut, and then we'll bring Scout in as well, that might.
Well, the ending is quite different. The ending of the film is quite different.
Okay.
The female protagonist is somehow, whereas in the theatrical release, she's kind of the victim. And in Toby's cut, she's I think I have that backwards. In Toby's cut, she's a bit of the victim. In the theatrical release, she is the evil interloper from the Western world. And so she gets what she deserves, basically. That's one aspect of it. There's a lot of really interesting things in the film. I've been privileged to look at a lot of the dailies from the film. So there's a lot of stuff that didn't find its way into even the director's cut that is spectacular. And it's, it's this age-old story. it's difficult. It's an uphill climb. It's a battle. Everything's a battle, and a lot of it is compromise.
Yeah.
You decide, you pick your battles. You decide where you're going to stand your ground and where you're going to give way. I rather like the film a lot. I'm a sucker for Tobe Hooper film, but I would say that the director's cut is an improvement over the theatrical release.
Well, Scal, let's bring you in. What are some of the aspects you would highlight?
I think Jin, I mean, again, as we're talking about Poltergeist and the things that you can and can't prove are him. Somebody mentioned earlier color theory. Going back to some of his earliest. What's that?
Oh, no, that was Stan, right?
No, it wasn't me. No,
That was me.
I would hope to not be so clueless as to quote myself, but no, Jin has my favorite Tobe Hooper device, which is that upon the precipice of self-discovery, specifically female self-discovery, and I kind of wonder how much of this ties into Tobe Hooper's understanding of, for instance, womb theory, which comes from Otto Rank, the philosopher who was a Freud student. But every time that your female characters are about to kind of walk up to these moments from which there is no return, this kind of walk into the horror of adulthood versus the sort of relative innocence of adolescence, there is this pulsing, blinding red light. It's in Invaders from Mars, and it's in the Funhouse. It's in Texas Chainsaw 2. Certainly the red dress from I'm Dangerous Tonight is a kind of a living personification of that red light and all that. But in Jin, it's everywhere. You can't watch that movie. That movie is deliberately sort of drained of color. Some of that is because digital photography at the time was less expressive than 35 millimeter film, which he had sort of gotten used to working on, or the cameras that they were using on television and stuff. All of that stuff was easier to do on film. In the 2000s, it kind of gets murkier. You look at Crocodile, certainly, and Toolbox Murders and Mortuary, which are great movies, but he kind of has to go to greater pains to figure out the color scheme. And in Jin, he at least knows that he can really push the red all the way up to the front of that to let you know that something is happening, this kind of moment of crossing a threshold, which again harks back to Poltergeist.
Oh, fantastic.
Can I say there's a real benefit to him working on HD on Jin? He could just let the camera roll and let the actors roll. Mm-hmm. And like I said, I've seen dailies, and it just runs 10, 15 minutes. They'll just run the scene. And that's a great advantage for, keying up your actors and finding those surprising moments. But, a conventional shoot, you can't just let the camera roll. So I think that was a benefit. And I think more people should see it.
So do we have to risk our lives to get a director's cut of this film? Who's passing these around?
Joe Bob, if you want it, I'll email it to you. You just got to give me an email address.
Okay.
You don't have to risk your life.
I don't know. Somebody in the United Arab Emirates is getting these out to the world that wants them. It sounds a little too dangerous. I don't know if I want that on my email profile. But I'll meet you somewhere.
I was going to say, I've already name dropped Muqtada al-Sadr on this particular live cast. I'm sure we're on a list already.
Okay.
You don't want to be alarmist, but it's just it hasn't been released. And will it ever be? We're not sure.
Well, we can all just hope that we get to share it privately, but like some sort of guilty little porn film or something. But
this is how it worked back in the day. Like there's director's cuts of films being passed around in VHSs. I forget what films of the sort, but work print and some things like that. I'm just saying, like
the spontaneous work print is on YouTube.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. With Hooper, there has been access to his work prints. And so I encourage everyone watching to check those out. They show a different vision of his films that the studios obviously interfered with. Every one of his films after his first.
Yeah, if you check out the rough cut, you will see a different film. You'll see a different intention. I think they're both equally valid, fascinating. I've said before, I love the film. I have a personal connection to it. But putting that aside, trying to be objective, look at the film, look at the rough cut, see what they meant, see what happened. It just enriches your experience of the film. I wish every film could be seen this way. You know, in many different, you read the script, see the film that's finished, see what they intended, maybe a rough cut. You have this kind of a growing perspective. You know, it's like a blossom. It's like flower blooming, and you see all of these petals at one time. It's fascinating, especially in the case of spontaneous combustion, unfairly derided motion picture.
Yeah. One thing that's really fortunate about looking at Hooper's work now is that almost all of it is available in many cases. Nice Blu-ray editions by Scream Factory, Arrow, soon Kino, and then work prints and other things on YouTube. In fact, after the nearly year-long trek to track down Peter, Paul, and Mary, The Song is Love, a couple of months ago, it appeared on YouTube, and it's there now, so people can go out and see it. For how long, who knows? But I'm segueing into a question that several people brought up in the chat, which is about Hooper's cinematic influences. You know, we've all kind of mentioned the fact that his style changes to fit the material. He'll have certain reoccurring symbols like the old dark house, sort of enraged, ineffectual, obsolescent male characters and so on. But his style changes a lot. And, you know, we know he was influenced by Hammer Pictures, particularly in his short film, The Heisters. He's been influenced by Hitchcock and early horror films like the Universal pictures and Nosferatu and stuff. But let's start with Joe Bob and then work our way back. Other influences that you all think are particularly important to understanding Hooper's work.
Well, he was fascinated by color, and he worked with color a lot, and then he was really, even though he's known for horror, he was really a devotee of every genre of film. I mean, he had watched every film that was released from the time he was a toddler, and so he probably took all kinds of cinematic cues from all kinds of directors from all kinds of genres. That's another thing that makes him difficult to talk about. You know, it's like when we talk about David Lynch, we know what we're talking about. We know exactly what we're talking about. You know, and we know that David Lynch had Final Cut. You know, Roger Corman said something really wise, I thought, about in his Academy Awards acceptance speech. He said, film is a corrupted art form because it's 50% art and it's 50% business. And this Tobe Hooper is a classic case of a guy who could do the art and could not do the business. He could do the business sometimes, and as he got and also the times that he had all the money were early in his career when he'd not yet developed all of his skill. And so as that's why, you know, we're having people rediscover things like the Mangler or the TV projects, because late in his career he has the skill now. He has the complete toolkit. He doesn't have the budget. And whereas on Salem's Lot and on Poltergeist, he had the budget, but he wasn't totally in charge of the pre-production, and he wasn't totally I think he wasn't 100% confident in his own skill. So
I think one of the most compelling things, though, in terms of that, is that when you see the in the TV work, where you definitely can't have control, you know, total or any control, because you're working for so many different creators, that there's a consistency across that work. You know, it's kind of almost uncanny, the consistency across that work. We talk about it in the introduction to the book. Unfortunately, we didn't get a full essay on that topic of Hooper's television work, and I think there needs to be a whole book or several more about his television work. But in what we were able to kind of pull together, we're noticing that there's, almost a kind of, this was kind of also the call out to Hooper as a sensibility politically and aesthetically, that there was a kind of, a consistency there that
if I can plug my own book here for a second. I think his television work is a very important look into Tobe Hooper the artist, because every time he stepped foot on a TV set, there was a guarantee of a certain level of production competence and budget, and that the crew was going to be there for, like every one of his needs. It doesn't matter what it was. He worked for the comparably high budget and highbrow and the extremely low budget and lowbrow. He made a pretty tawdry little thing for network television in about 1993, this kind of ghost stories thing, which has shades of Nickelodeon's Are You Afraid of the Dark about it, at the same time that he was doing an extremely high budget version episode of Tales from the Crypt with John Rhys Davies and Whoopi Goldberg, of all people. He could navigate both of those things, and he knew what to do with both the low budget and the show with no expectations. I think that Ghost Stories thing ran on UPN, which should tell you about the particular artistic expectations foisted upon him for that assignment. But I think that his TV work is the perfect window into who he was as a professional. The Perversions of Science episode and the Great Nowhere Man episodes, and of course the Taken stuff, again, proof that he and Steven Spielberg were not at loggerheads and that there was no love lost between the two of them, because he worked for Spielberg 3 times in his life, once for Taken and once for Amazing Stories and once on Poltergeist. And if he hated that guy, he wouldn't have taken those assignments, but he didn't, because he was a soft-spoken guy and he knew that Steven Spielberg understood him and that they were friends and that he was going to make it work, and that Steven Spielberg was ultimately going to keep giving him opportunities that mattered to him. But I want to say about the Perversions of Science episode, to me, the most important thing in the Tobe Hooper lineage is Orson Welles. There are a million angles all throughout Tobe Hooper's filmography that hark back to Orson Welles. And in the Perversions of Science episode, he literally retells the story of the War of the Worlds broadcast as if it was really happening. He changes the names, and so he gets to have fun with it. And the whole thing is that 2 aliens hear the broadcast and think that the invasion has started, and so they need to get to their location or all that. And it's like hilarious. It's great. It's the best thing Jamie Kennedy's ever done, other than maybe Scream 2. But regardless, Welles is the secret backbone of so much of Hooper's work. You see it in the Lofstrand canes and the leg braces that Robert Englund wears in The Mangler, and the Ambersons tracking shot, the tracking shot into the Ambersons ball. This was also sort of the linchpin of my book, was seeing how many Tobe Hooper tracking shots looked exactly like the shots from The Stranger, which is Orson Welles' great anti-Nazi film, and then, of course, Magnificent Ambersons. And Ambersons, of course, has another fascinating little entree into a horror history, because Val Lewton reused the set to make Cat People. And so I feel like, and I'm doing a little work on his behalf, but I can't help but do it, because I can't help but see in Hooper somebody who is as excited by horror history and Hollywood history and the way that they intersect as I am. I can't help but feel like he watched those things and was equally as excited by them. And so there's so much Ambersons about the whole idea of being brought across the threshold of high society and all this stuff. And of course, just the beautiful sweeping camera movements, which are everywhere. He was still doing them in Gin, which was his final film, unfortunately. And I just see so much of Welles everywhere. The villain from Lady from Shanghai has the same, gait as the villain in The Mangler, and so that's my answer to that prompt.
That's pretty good. That's a good influence to have, right?
I don't disagree.
Thank
I
you,
think
Stan.
However, I think that the comparison is fraught because Welles is so often viewed as a one-hit wonder, who had nothing but problems and troubles subsequently. Exactly. And Toby's viewed the same way. Chainsaw was a phenomenon. And he could never escape its shadow, which is just sad. He is so much more than just the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So
Well, I mean,
much.
it's the same way
Knowing
that
the
like
rest of the catalog,
people
you can
still
appreciate Chainsaw.
yeah, but I mean, people still had trouble with Other Side of the Wind when that came out. Famously, Joe Dante didn't really think that should have been released, and I think a lot of people agree. I think William Friedkin said that it shouldn't have been released, which, I mean, it's William Friedkin, so who knows? But
I totally disagree. I think it's wonderful.
I think Other Side of the Wind is great too, but Dave Kerr, the great Dave Kerr, disagrees with me that you could release Orson Welles' The Deep right now with the footage that we have extant from the Munich Film Museum. But I kind of think that with about $100,000 and a year's worth of post-production, you could get that out there. I've seen the dailies. They're very good and they're almost done. And in the same way, I kind of want, like you were saying, these beautiful Blu-ray releases of every single Tobe Hooper, thing. There was talk for a minute of a Maya Deren box set at Criterion, and I begged the people at Criterion to let me make a video essay about the link between Tobe Hooper and Maya Deren. I never heard back, which is fine because I don't think that box set is ever coming out. But that's the kind of ephemera that I would like to see now. We've sort of broken down the barriers of that sort of thing, and it doesn't seem like you need a huge audience to release an incredible DVD box set.
There's an essay in American Twilight that makes those links too. So just a little plug there. Boom.
Buy our books.
Yeah. Yes, that's the essay on eggshells, right? By Mario.
Well, there's an essay on eggshells by Mario, and there's also the one on Down Friday Street, Gin, and Toolbox Murders that also makes the link between Darren and Hooper in terms of the kind of associative spaces. And yeah.
So, well, as we run short on time and we need to do thank yous and everything, I want to go back to Joe Bob one last time and say, with the coincidental, we Scout and Chris and I didn't know each other prior to this. The coincidental release of the first two, well, not the first two, because John Frederick Muir had Eaten Alive, right?
Kenneth, yeah.
John Kenneth Muir had Eaten Alive, but the first two fully comprehensive books about Hooper's career. What would you say you'd like to see, or what you predict will be the ongoing legacy of Hooper for upcoming film fans, mutants, students?
I don't know. I think Tobe. I mean, I am blown away that. In about the year 2000, I called up Kim Henkel on the phone and I told him I'd seen Eggshells, and he says, "What? You saw that? Are you kidding? I thought we destroyed every copy." and now, 21 years later, there are academic essays about Eggshells, and so that transition from this type of director making this type of movie being sort of ignored at best and despised at worst, because we didn't talk at all about the censorship heat that lasted for years and years and years, especially on Chainsaw. For that to have turned around in 2 decades, so that you guys have put out the first academic reevaluation. So I think you're launching, you with this book are launching the conversation. There's not been a conversation. There's not been a real conversation. There have been, when I first started writing about Tobe's films, the term popular culture did not exist. That's how old I am. And so, so a lot of films that we love today would not have been reviewed by the New York Times. They would not have been reviewed by any respectable newspaper. There were just a handful of us that were writing about these things. And so in my lifetime, it's changed to where now we're having real conversations about the real artistry of these films. And that's a great thing. I am so glad that you guys are doing it. But the conversation is just starting now as to whether, as to how he's remembered and what he's remembered for. I learned a lot of things tonight. you know, and it's like, now I'm going to go back and watch The Mangler tomorrow, you know, because
Yes.
so I think it's a remains to be seen thing, and your book is an excellent starting place. I mean, I've read some of the articles, I've browsed some of the other articles, and I've learned a lot just from this conversation that you've started with other academics. There should be more interplay between the popular press and the academic press, and horror is one of the few places where there is that, you know, where that does happen. Yeah. And so that's my answer. It's all on you.
Well, let's get some thank yous in here. We have so much. This could go on for another 4 or 6 hours. I do want to say to one questioner who asked about Tobe Hooper's direction of Billy Idol's video for Dancing with Myself.
Fuck yeah.
We have an excellent essay by Jerry Metz on that video in conversation with Dance of the Dead, the episode of Masters of Horror that Hooper did. Chris, take it away.
Same. I was taking notes on the questions, and we were talking to Cameron about making sure people's questions who didn't get answered will have a chance to be responded to. So we're gonna make a copy of the chat and make sure that we respond in some way to these questions in a way that you can access the answers. In the American Twilight book, there, besides Jerry Metz's essay on Dancing with Myself, someone had asked about Freddy's Nightmares. Does someone address that? And Bridget Cherry does in the first chapter. Hooper's TV work is addressed in, at least as far as we could, in the introduction. The question about, we'll have to table the question about Texas Chainsaw: The Next Generation, which I really wanted to hear an answer to, but anyway. But yeah, so thank yous. We just want to, we don't want to keep you all night, and it's Zoom, so there's a fatigue that comes with that as well, especially if you're listening. I want to thank the University of Texas Press, especially Jim Burr, Lynn Ferguson, Bailey Morrison, and Cameron Ludwig, who ran our program tonight, and the Collective for Research on Epistemologies and Ontologies of Embodied Risk in Montreal. The FRQSC in Quebec, who funded the honoraria for the speakers tonight. We should also offer a sincere thanks to John Kenneth Muir, who wasn't part of the speakers today, but whose critical survey of Hooper, called Eaten Alive at a Chainsaw Massacre, became a consistent sounding board for a number of essays in American Twilight. We noticed how many times, you know, when there's nothing, you go to what there is. And so that was what there was. And people were using Muir's, you know, discussion as a starting point. It's important. One more time, you can get your copy of our book, American Twilight, Cinema of Tobe Hooper, at a 30% discount through November 30th at utexaspress.com with the promo code UTXTOBE. That's pronounced Toby, not Tobe. And thank you to Stan Giese, whose name I just learned how to pronounce like yesterday after speaking to him for like 2 years. We can't wait for your book on spontaneous combustion. We can't wait for your book on I'm Dangerous Tonight. We're excited for those. Thank you to Julius Banzon, who, and we hope everybody out there heads over to the Tobe Hooper Appreciation Society that Julius runs, because it's full of a lot of really incredible curation and scholarship.
Backlog. It's been a while since I updated it.
Thanks very much to Scout Tafoya. After you get your copy of American Twilight, be sure to check out Scout's book, Cinemophagy on the Psychedelic Classical Form of Tobe Hooper, available from Miniver Press. And thank you to Joe Bob Briggs for making time to be here tonight. Go to joebobbriggs.com to see his tour schedule. His brand new Halloween Hoedown featuring Angel and Terror Train, as well as episodes of the first 3 seasons of The Last Drive-In with Joe Bob Briggs and Darcy the Mail Girl are available on Shudder.com. common. Season 4 is coming soon. Date on that, Joe Bob?
Yeah, season 4 is, we have several specials before we start season 4. So,
Oh, great.
yeah, we just had
So
the
special.
Halloween Hoedown last week, and our guests on the Halloween Hoedown, if you want to watch it, are David Gordon Green and Jason Blum. And
Yeah, fantastic.
I would highly recommend the Jason Blum interview, simply because a lot of people in these circles don't realize the influence that money has on the artistic process. and so I think if you listen to this Jason Blum interview, you'll get a more realistic sense of of how the process works.
Great. More specials coming in November. Yeah, it's a fantastic interview with Jason Blum and David Gordon Green as well. Finally, Joe Bob, I hope you won't mind me saying this, but we want to thank Tobe Hooper for always doing things the drive-in way.
Oh yeah.
Thank you. Thanks again, everyone. Thank you all for coming. We didn't get to talk about so much stuff. Read Tobe Hooper's novel, Midnight Movie. Go watch all of the stuff. Read the books. Watch Joe Bob Briggs on Last Drive-In. And thanks again for coming tonight.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.